taxes, fury, feathers. A rebel in arms takes on a guy named George. No, not that one. That one. It's the Whiskey Rebellion on this episode of Bigfoot's Great American History Show. The primary cause of the Whiskey Rebellion was, ironically, the same as that of the American Revolution, namely unwanted taxes. In this case, an excise on distilled spirits, which the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, had pushed through Congress in an effort to strengthen the financial power of the federal government. Unlike import duties, which were paid by importers and built into the price of a product, the so-called whiskey tax was levied on producers inside the United States and was thus much more visible and, as a result, much more controversial. By the late 18th century, whiskey had become a popular product of farms up and down the American frontier. Jim Beam, for example, began selling bourbon in 1795, only a year after the end of the Whiskey Rebellion. Never mind the more inherent reasons for whiskey's popularity, distilling spirits from corn or rye was simply good business. Grain, of course, was perishable and would spoil on the long journey to markets back east. Whiskey made from those grains, however, could be safely transported over the mountains. For much the same reason, Johnny Appleseed's famous apples would later largely be used for making hard cider. Frontier farmers thus felt unfairly singled out by Hamilton's plan. Adding insult to injury, the law required that the tax be paid in cash, which was still largely unavailable in the West. Indeed, whiskey itself was often used as a form of payment. Beneath the surface, however, the anger was directed at more than just the tax. Farmers in the West were, by and large, poorer than their counterparts in the East. Hamilton's Federalists, who had conceived of the tax, were rightly seen as the party of the aristocracy. George Washington himself would amass some 70,000 acres of land before his death. While the president remained generally popular, many Western farmers nevertheless felt unrepresented by his new government. They had never approved of the new Constitution, ratified in 1788, and remained indignant that a seemingly distant federal body had been given the right to interfere in local affairs. Following the passage of the whiskey tax, protesters began to sing the Revolution-era refrain of "No taxation without representation." To this, Hamilton and the Federalists responded that since democratic elections had been held, Congress had every right to introduce new taxes. By 1794, reports of a bloody revolution in France had reached the American frontier, and protesters began echoing French cries of liberty and equality. One leader of the resistance, lawyer David Bradford, is even said to have likened himself to Maximilien Robespierre, the face of the French Revolution's reign of terror. Incited by men like Bradford and inspired by their own revolutionary past, rebels in the West refused to pay the tax, set up mock guillotines, tarred and feathered tax collectors, robbed the mail, closed federal courts, and even threatened to seize weapons held by the federal garrison in Pittsburgh. Elsewhere in western Pennsylvania, protests turned deadly. Unlike every other backcountry region in the nation, officials in Pennsylvania were making genuine efforts to collect the tax. Inevitably, the conflict escalated. At the climax of the so-called Battle of Bower Hill, a mob of 600 protesters surrounded the home of tax collector John Neville, resulting in the deaths of several protesters and the burning of Neville's home. By the beginning of August, nearly 7,000 rebels had gathered at Braddock's Field, a mere 8 miles from Pittsburgh. Facing this very real threat of an attack, Pittsburgh citizens expelled Federalist sympathizers and offered the rebels several barrels of whiskey as a peace offering.
Always a welcome gesture, I find.
I mean, true enough, the gesture and, let's face it, the alcohol itself appeased the rebels, at least to some degree, and in the end they settled for a defiant march through town. "I am threatened from all quarters in my own country," wrote one tax collector in Virginia, William McCleery. "Pennsylvanians came into our town and ordered me to give up my papers, as they would come and destroy them with all my property. In the meantime, no collection can go on." McCleery should have heeded the protesters' warning to flee. On August 9, 1794, an angry mob surrounded his home, and he was forced to disguise himself as a slave and swim across a river to escape. No, I'm not going to make a joke about that. No, I know. He wore blackface to save his life. Federal authority had been challenged by an armed insurrection, and President Washington could not let that challenge go unchecked. In response to the protests, he called for the raising up of militia from Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia. At the same time, he continued to hope for a peaceful resolution. In August, he appointed 3 peace commissioners to meet with the rebels and hear their grievances. Alas, in the midst of so much anger, the talks were destined to fail. On September 24th, the president received a recommendation from the commissioners. In their opinion, it was absolutely necessary that the civil authority should be aided by a military force. Or to quote another American legend, guns. Lots of guns. So it was that the 62-year-old father of his country found himself, in the words of the human song screamer Steven Tyler, back in the saddle again. The former commander-in-chief of the Continental Army personally reviewed the troops at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and rode with them as far as Bedford before placing them in the hands of Revolutionary War veteran Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. At nearly 13,000 strong, the force was comparable in size to any single army Washington had commanded during the Revolution. Outnumbered and outgunned, the rebels dispersed before the militia fired even a single shot. American Robespierre himself, David Bradford, fled southwest to Spanish Louisiana and escaped capture. Meanwhile, 20 token prisoners were brought to Philadelphia to face trial. 2 were convicted of treason and sentenced to hang, but this was all much ado about nothing. Neither had been a leader of the rebellion, and Washington pardoned them both. By then, of course, the president was at liberty to show leniency. His point had been made, loud and clear. By raising militia and dispersing the rebellion, he had proven the new government's ability to maintain the rule of law and thus reaffirmed its legitimacy. If you enjoyed this episode, do us a favor, like and subscribe to our channel, tap that notification bell, maybe offer the jackalope a positive affirmation in the comments. He's been going through some stuff. Until next time, this is Bigfoot saying so long and save me a seat at your next campfire.
Whiskey. Rebellion. Whiskey. Rebellion. Whiskey.
Jackalope?
Rebellion.
Jackalope? Hey, you with me, buddy?